Today is 5 September 2008. We are at the New York State Military Museum in Saratoga Springs, and we are interviewing Mr. Gerald Pendas. Mr. Pendas, for the record, would you please state your full name and your date and place of birth?
Gerald G. Pendas, Jr. I was born 12 June 1930 in New York City, Manhattan, at the height of the Depression. And my father lost his job with the government. He was working in the federal prison. And we moved up to Amsterdam, New York, and spent a few years up there living with my grandparents until we moved to Albany, New York. And I grew up on Kent Street in Albany, New York, going to School 4, School 16, both public schools. My dad worked at Hedrick's Brewery. Then we moved out into Colony, the village of Colony. And we're just on the border with Schenectady County, and everybody west of Bly Road went to high school in Schenectady. So although I lived in Albany County, I went to school in Schenectady. And from Schenectady, I went up to Barker, New York, and was at Barker Central School in the residence center there for a while. I'd always wanted to join the Marine Corps because one of the veterans that came back from World War II had given me a Marine Corps emblem when I was about 11 or 12 years old, and I read about and heard a lot about the Marine Corps, so I wanted very much to be in the Marine Corps. And I also met some Marines that had come back that were wounded from the Second World War. I enlisted when I was 15, but I was caught, didn't get away with it, so I waited till the day after I was 17 and joined the Marine Corps.
Now, did you drop out of high school at that point?
I did. I did not finish high school, dropped out, joined the Marine Corps on my 17th birthday, went to Parris Island Marine Corps Recruit Depot, 2nd Battalion, and went through boot camp at Parris Island. And from there I was assigned to Sea School at Portsmouth, Virginia. And after Sea School I went aboard the aircraft carrier, the USS Coral Sea.
Now let me ask you about this Sea School. What was that all about? What kind of training did you receive?
Sea School was just pomp and ceremony and a little bit of gun drill because we manned the secondary batteries aboard ship. But at the time, seagoing detachments were just something that was put between the sailors and the command. We had most of the duties were just look pretty duties, but we did run the brig. We were the communications orderly, and we were orderlies to the captain and the executive officer. But Sea School was mostly just drills, uniforms, parades, and just pomp and ceremony that we would be required to use aboard ship. We did go to Damnick, Virginia for anti-aircraft school, just secondary batteries, and we did man the 20-millimeter batteries aboard the aircraft carrier. I was on the carrier for 2 years. I got off the carrier, went to the Brooklyn Navy Yard awaiting discharge. I was due to get out in 14th of July.
And what year was that?
That was in 1949.
49, okay.
But it got into 1950. I was still at the Brooklyn Navy Yard, and 14th of July, my enlistment was over. I was thinking about re-enlistment, but the Korean War started on the 25th of June when the North Koreans invaded South Korea. And there was a draft that was formed from the Brooklyn Navy Yard that was going to Camp Pendleton to join the 1st Marine Division, and I wasn't on the draft because I was a short timer. I got an audience with the adjutant of the Marine Barracks at Brooklyn and told him I'd like very much to be on that draft. Could I re-enlist? He said, well, if you re-enlist for 6 years, we'll let you go. Big deal. So I did re-enlist. We got on a troop train. We picked up Marines from Earl, New Jersey, all the ammunition depots across the country. It was a troop train. It took us 6 days to get across the United States and to Camp Pendleton.
And what rank were you at that point?
I was a corporal at the time. I got off the aircraft carrier as a corporal, went aboard as a private, and 27 months later I made corporal. I was sent to the 1st Marine Regiment, and I was further assigned to George Company, 3rd Battalion, 1st Marine Regiment. I went down there and I became a squad leader because I was a corporal. Then as the sergeants started coming in, I went down to be a fire team leader. And then there was a cry out for men that wanted to be snipers. I went to the platoon sergeant who knew me by then, and I said, I want very much to get that job. I want to get that job. He said, well, you're a corporal. They want to just take PFC. So I went and saw the first sergeant and told him that I had a little bit of experience with marksmanship. I'd been a rifle range coach. I fired on the Brooklyn Navy Yard team when we went to Quantico. I'd always fired expert riflemen. I just told them I really wanted the job. I could do a good job for them. They were insisting on taking PFCs, but I went to the lieutenant, and people started interviewing me. Finally, I got the job. There was no training at all. There was no sniper school. All we got was the 03 rifle, and we went out.
Now, did that have a scope on
It
it?
had an 8-power Intertel scope on it.
Okay.
It was a Star Gauge 03, and the story that we had been told is that when Winchester or Remington or whoever made the perfect 03 rifle, a bolt action 5-shot rifle, when they made a perfect rifle, they put a star on the muzzle of the rifle to signify that all the tolerances in the weapon were absolutely perfect. So that's what we got, Star Gauge 03 rifles and 8-power Intertel scopes. The scopes were really made for marksmanship, competitive shooting. They were for indoors or known distance. They were not a field scope. They had a great big elevation knob on them and a great big windage knob on them, and there were no markings up or down or left or right. You knew nothing about it. And there was no graduations, 0, 10. There were no numbers at all, just marks. So it was strictly a competitive scope. It wasn't meant for the field, but nonetheless, that's what we got. We had an old gunnery sergeant that was in charge of us, and he just took us out to the firing ranges, and we didn't fire at the known distances. We got up on hills where you had to guess what the range was, and we fired up to about 600 yards and zeroed these 03 rifles and zeroed our telescopes. The rest of the training was just getting us in shape physically. We had a lot of forced marches and just marching and with heavy duty packs, field transport packs and light marching packs, but it was just marching and just getting our bodies conditioned for the heat and the trials of Korea. We boarded ship, went to Japan. We were at Atsugi, a former Japanese base. And then we trained from there, and then we boarded LSTs in Yokohama, and we went and landed at Incheon on landing vehicle tractors. They weren't the boats, they were tractors. We were on the second wave. I was in boat 2-2. The first wave of that operation on Blue Beach for the 1st Marines was supposed to be Army in LVTs, landing vehicle track, with a 75 millimeter cannon on the front of them, and they were going to blow holes in the wall. Now the seawall was the barrier that we had to overcome. The tides were 32 feet. Now that's an obscene number to realize that the water would drop 32 feet, but it did in Korea. At Incheon, there was a 32-foot tidal drop. So we had made wooden ladders. Some of them we expected to go over the wall, but I was in the command tractor with the commander of the LVTs and the commander of my platoon. I was in the 1st platoon. And the commander decided not to go at the seawall, but there was a small channel. It was just a sewer, but all the waste and water that came down from the port of Incheon came down through this little creek, and we went right up the creek. And there were about 6 or 7 tractors, the whole 1st platoon and part of the rest of the company. We got out of the tractors, we were in barbed wire, we were under fire. The typical naval amphibious operation, the Navy shelling the beach with their 5-inch, even the Missouri was shooting 16-inch guns. And we had a lot of naval aviation, a lot of Marine fighter pilots in their Corsairs dropping bombs and strafing the port for us and doing what they could to suppress the enemy fire. There was a barbed wire fence there, and we had just got out of our LVTs and we're just getting prepared to go, and we didn't know if we were going to go up the ditch or through the barbed wire. And one of the fire team leaders of the platoon, Corporal Buck Barnes, was the first man up to the wire, and he went to cut the wire, and he was the first man killed in the company. He went down, another man went up, and finally a Navy corpsman with a bolo knife just ran up there, a hospital corpsman who was supposed to tend to the wounded and smash the fence down with a machete. Of course, we all streamed through there then. We had plenty of barbed wire cutters, and we cut the wire and got through there. And we were under small arms fire, and it's just your initial blooding in combat is something that you must explain, that you have you have involuntary control over your body. A lot of us urinated in our pants. You attempt to throw up, you vomit, you have the dry heaves, but it only lasts for about 30 seconds. And then you realize that somebody's trying to kill you. You get over that very fast and you start returning fire. And we moved through that, took our first objective, and the Navy, typical LSTs, not knowing anybody was on that hill, we'd moved so fast, thought it was the enemy, so they opened up with their 40mm and 5-inch guns on us. Luckily, I think there was only one man wounded, but we finally got them to stop. But there was a lot of LSTs that thought they were going to win the war. They have a gun up on the front tub of the LST, and they were firing right into us because we went through the port so fast and got our objectives. We took them immediately. And I think the story was that some of the Marines actually turned their 30 caliber machine guns around and shot back at the LSTs to let them know that they were doing the wrong thing. But they finally, that subsided. We spent the night there. We were probed a little bit. We jumped off the next morning in the assault. We were coming off the beach, and we were moving down a road, and up came a Jeep, and in it was the division commander and the assistant division commander, Oliver Prince Smith, Major General, and Brigadier General Craig. And there they were, right in amongst us, and they just gave us hello to the company commander and what have you, and just kept right on moving. We were just after they left, as we went through a pass, which they had gone through with their Jeep, we got grenades rolled in on the top of us as a cut in the road, and we sent a fire team up there, and they kept on lobbing grenades into us, and there were about 5 of them up there. It was just a suicidal mission, but what they had done, they had allowed the entire column to go through, and then when we had the machine guns right in the middle, that's what they wanted to do, the damage to the machine guns. We quickly assaulted them. There were 5 of them up there. They kept on firing at us, and at that point, I saw one of the bravest things that I've ever seen done in the war, and it was a corpsman, a Navy hospital corpsman, that ran up to one of the Marines that was wounded in the street and was patching him up. And they rolled another grenade down on top of him in the middle of the road. He just gathered up his patient and covered him with his body, and the grenade went off. Surely he got some shrapnel in the buttocks and in the back, and he stood up and started working on the patient again. And the other corpsman, seeing that hit the first corpsman, we had 2 corpsmen, hospital corpsmen, to the platoon, that his partner had been wounded, ran right out and pulled his trousers down and started working on him. But there was one corpsman repairing the wounds on another corpsman, and the corpsman saving the life of another Marine. And they were just out in the open, receiving small arm fires and what have you. And then we eliminated those 5 and moved on. We boarded tanks, and it was a tank infantry assault, and about the 3rd day, we moved so fast that we came upon the enemy. They would just stand up and not know what was going on. And at the time, there's many people that claim that they did it, but we were stopped on the column of tanks where the road turned to the right. And there was a small little village there, but there was a house, a hooch, as you might call it, not a normal house, just a mud hut. And alongside it was a huge haystack, and the haystack, the mounds were laid up against this building or this fence. And out of the fence came a black stovepipe. It just didn't make any sense at all. And we're just sitting there within 50 feet of it looking at it and wondering what was going to go on, and all of a sudden that black stovepipe started to move and it started to come down. So we started beating on the top of the tank with our bare hands and pistols and butts of the rifles and everything, trying to tell them tank, tank, tank. And we saw that it was a tank camouflaged in those bales of hay, but you could only see the muzzle. So we all dove off the tank, and the 90mm of the tank, he must have been told by the tank that was in back of him, but he got the idea, and he just swung around, pivoted his gun, a 90 millimeter gun. At 50 feet, he blew that tank up, just blew him away. Well, some of the blast from that 90 millimeter, there was one guy that was slow getting off the tank, and he broke his leg. But we waited there a little more because we realized then that they had their tanks, and some had been eliminated earlier, but we were standing there on our tanks, getting ready to go, but the road turned to the right, and it was an open stretch of rice paddy, maybe 500-600 yards. It would have just been a perfect tank trap for us to get out in the middle of the ocean, I mean, middle of the rice paddies, and if there were other tanks, they would have done away with them. So, and all of a sudden, around the corner comes a motorcycle with a sidecar. It's a North Korean motorcycle with a sergeant driving it and a warrant officer in the front seat. He's got an attaché case. And as soon as he came around, everybody started shooting at him. I was on top with a 50 caliber machine gun that was a weapon of opportunity for infantrymen that belonged to the tank. And I just busted a couple of rounds off, and I saw the spotlight go off the front of the motorcycle. They were dead before they'd gone 5 feet. And the motorcycle just kept on coasting, and we thought, well, it's got a bomb on it. So we all kind of ducked, and it crashed into a telephone pole, and there was no bomb on it. We went and grabbed the attaché case and gave it to an intelligence scout, and they run it back to battalion, and a couple of days later they told us that he had a message to tell all the tanks at Incheon to retreat, to come on back. They didn't realize we were that far ahead. But most of it was in the assault. I got my nickname Peep Sight at that time. We were blown off the tanks by a heavy machine gun, and that was they had a little water-cooled machine gun with little, very small wheels, and it was at a good distance, and it blew us off. And the lieutenant found it with his glasses, and he called me up. He said, "Pendas, come up here." And I scout sniper, and I went up, and he said, he pointed it out to me, so I took a zero in on it, and I make the initial comment that the scope was not meant for the field, and as I'd been 3 days carrying that rifle, sometimes at sling arms, I could hear the elevation and the windage going off as he went through the brush. There was no way of knowing, there was no marking on it, so I aimed at the gunner. I could just, at that distance, all you could see through the telescope is just a bare little silhouette, not even as big as your little, no, it's just about the size of the tip of a pen. And two of them, I could see two of them. It was about 750 yards. I aimed at the gunner who was still shooting at us. I let one go, and the telescope, as I said, was competitive. You had to reach up, pull it back, work your bow, put another round in the chamber, and look at it. And there he was, still there. I missed him. But I could see some kind of movement, and I looked, and the assistant gunner was going over. So I'd aimed at the gunner and killed the assistant gunner. I realized what I'd done really quick, and I knew about Kentucky windage, so I just aimed at the little building that they were alongside of the bunker, and took enough Kentucky windage and shot and got the gunner. And I realized my scope was off about 30 some odd inches on windage. It was a point of humiliation to say, take the telescope away from him, Lieutenant, because they realized he wanted the lieutenant to want to know, he was watching through the 7x50 binoculars, why I hadn't taken the gunner out first. And I said, well, the light and the smoke and I've not known distance, not known exactly. I just making up excuses. And they said, take the telescope away from him, make him use the peep sight. So they started calling me peep sight just to rub my ass a little bit. And it stuck, and some 60 years later it's still there. But we're mostly in the assault. We fought through the city of Seoul. We set up in a prison. It was shaped like a wagon wheel, and it was full of prisoners, and we didn't know who they were, bad guys or what, but they mostly were probably political prisoners. And we didn't let them go, but at the time the North Koreans started dropping mortar shells in on the prison. I think they were trying to kill all of these. They were probably, some of them that they hadn't killed, some teachers and some people with education, and probably pretty good people, but we didn't know right from wrong, so we just left it for the Korean Republic of Korea Army to come in and sort it all out. And we pretty much went back to the streets after that, and at one point we were at these roadblocks, and the roadblocks were made out of basket weaved sacks, and they weighed about 100 kilos, which is more than 100 pounds. And they were full of dirt and stone and everything, and they were across this main boulevard, which was called Maypo Boulevard, Maypo Boulevard. And that night, they assaulted us with tank infantry attack. They had 3 T-34 tanks, and the T-34 tank had 2 sponson tanks on the back of it for fuel. And if you got those leaking, you got a couple of rounds through the sponson tanks, that fuel, that diesel fuel, might eventually ignite on the hot engine that was in the back also. But that night they attacked with a tank. One of our sergeants picked up a 3.5 rocket launcher. It was at night, and fired around, hit the muzzle of this T-34 tank. They backed up. They were retreated because we had killed all their infantry. We had our machine guns all zeroed in on them, and we were on the roadblock, and they didn't have a chance coming down that boulevard. The tank backed up, ran over a mine, and exploded and lost the track. The other tank backed up. It did the same thing. We had mined the road out in front, and it was disabled, but that was the 25th of September, about 10 days after we landed, 25th and 26th. And that was just about the end of the North Koreans in the city of Seoul. And then, as you know, then MacArthur came in and gave the country back to Syngman Rhee, and we just folded up our little tent, so to speak, and went back to the Incheon, the sandy beach. And we were waiting for our orders. At the time, everybody figured the war was over. It really was over. But we were going to go around to the eastern shore of Korea, and we were going to go on queen boats. They call them Q-boats. They were American LSTs that were given to the Japanese Navy. They had a Japanese crew, a Japanese captain, and everything. And when we were down at the beach waiting to get aboard, the Army had all kinds of supplies there. Of course, Marines will steal, and we stole most of the rations. The Army had their cases of cornflakes, mayonnaise, jellies, tea, soup, everything we could get our hands. And we carried it back. It was pretty clever the way we stole all that stuff, but I won't go into that. But then we got aboard these Q-boats, and we went around the tip of Korea, past Incheon, over on the eastern shore of Korea. And then they discovered that the harbors were mined. Hwonsan, Hamhung, they were all mined. So we just went back and forth for 3 days. I think it was almost 7 days back and forth. The amount of days that I've lost in my memory how many it was. But all that food that we had stolen, we were down to 1 meal a day, and we were eating cornflakes and dried milk and whatever we had taken from them. We were even trying to get food off the Japanese crew, which had plenty of rice, and they shared it with us. There was just maybe 2 platoons, maybe 80 men, 80 to 100 men on board this LST, maybe more, I don't know how many, but all the food that we had taken and all the food that was there we had eaten, and we had eaten the Japanese. So when we got off that LST at Hamhung, we were ready to go to war because we were angry, we were hungry. But they were there to meet us, and we got a lot of catcalls from the Army and the Air Force because Bob Hope had been through there 3 days before. So it really wasn't any kind of a resistance in the landing. And from there we just boarded trains and went inland and as far as we could with a train, the North Korean train, and took trucks, and we went into a little town called M.O.H. And M.O.H. was the hub of the transportation network. The road coming up from the south met at M.O.H. The road going to Poyang to the west met at M.O.H. And the road going up to the Yellow River all met there. So we just established a roadblock there. The entire battalion was there. And the North Koreans came in by the truckload every day and surrendered. And we had them in a little compound, but we just couldn't. There were hundreds of them surrendering every day, turning themselves in. We collected their weapons. Some of them had thrown away their weapons, but we interrogated them and found out they were all soldiers. And we would put them on a small 2.5-ton truck, not a small, it's a large truck. It's a 8-wheeler. And we would get them in a squatting position and wire their hands together with comm wire. It's the only thing we had, so they couldn't jump off. And we put the canvas over the top of them and tie it down real tight so the truck wasn't up high like a normal truck would, it was low. And we had captured some women. I think we put 1 or 2 women on each convoy, and we would send not quite a platoon with them in to go back to the beach where the prisoners would be interrogated and worked over by the parties to be and decide who was to go where and who weren't prisoners and who weren't. But we very seldom got them all in there because we would be attacked along this road going back. And the North Koreans would attack us and they would shoot the business out of those trucks, not knowing what was in it, but there was their own people. And at this time, I have a very good friend that shot a North Korean off his horse. That was the first time there was ever any report of the North Koreans using cavalry, but they were mounted. Some of them, about a half a dozen, were mounted. And my friend Jack Dunn shot one off of his horse at about 500 yards. And he said, "What a shot." Yeah, good shot. But they were on horseback, so we drove them off. It was kind of a mess. One of the trucks had gone off the road. A lot of people were hurt in it. We got the wounded out of the truck. We got the dead that we could get them back on the truck. And then we pulled out of there as fast as we could. We couldn't find 2 or 3 of our Marines. We hardly ever leave anybody behind. And I say hardly. We say that we don't leave anybody behind, but sometimes there's nothing you can do about it. Some people are left behind. 2 of them were left behind. So they came back the next day with a reinforced platoon and a tank coming back in. And we found our dead, which had been mutilated by the North Koreans. Brady had a Purple Heart in the back of his pack that he had been awarded around Thanksgiving. No, before we went over to this was in November the 10th. And they had pinned it to his tongue, and they had put mess gear in the proper places, improper places of some of the dead Marines. It kind of made us a little angry, so we weren't too kind with them. But as I said, we had women in there, but we never got one of the women out alive. They would be trampled by their own people or killed in the convoy going back. Never one of them alive. They were alive when we put them in there and wired them together, but I guess the soldiers or whoever it was thought they were doing them a favor. I have no idea, but we never got a woman out of there alive. And they were North Korean women soldiers. After that, we pulled out the entire battalion. We'd taken probably 1,000 prisoners or more. And we came back, and then we started back up to the Chosin Reservoir. And it was a long road up, a winding road, and it was getting colder by the minute. And we got up at the top of this plain, and there was a level plain with 2 mountain ranges on top of it. What the elevation was, I have no idea. But it was pretty high up, but there was a small stream going through this plateau, railroad tracks, and then a berm with a road on it. And then the 2 mountain ranges on each side of it, up at the elevation we were, as high as we were. The 5th and 7th Marines were on the left flank of the Chosin Reservoir as it comes down, and the Army was on the right flank, or the eastern portion of the reservoir. And we were the 3rd Battalion, and George Company was the last ones up there. And we came up, and we were at the top of the plateau, which was called Coterie. There was 1 battalion at Coterie. There was another battalion below Coterie on the road, guarding the road. And the 3rd Battalion, our battalion, was supposed to be at Hagaru, which was 11 miles away. So we were going to go in to reinforce Hagaru. And we jumped off in the assault the next morning. We took the 1st ridge line, took the 2nd ridge line, and there were plenty of North Koreans out there. And my platoon sergeant, Jerry Tillman, platoon sergeant Tillman, got shot in 2 rounds from a burp gun right in the skull in the front forehead. he was dead, but they didn't know it. He was still gargling and talking and everything, but it was, I tried to get him down. Another Marine and myself, we got him on a, pulled him down, dragged him down the snow, and then we got a litter, and then the litter bearers came up, and the chaplain, Navy chaplain, wanted to give him the last rites. I wouldn't let him do it, because I knew he was going to live, but in my heart I knew Jerry was dead, but platoon sergeant was dead, but it just, it bothered me quite a bit. So I went back up on the ridge, and what the North Koreans were doing, they were out there quite a ways, and we saw a bunker where they were, and our first sergeant, Rocco Zulo, got a 3.5 rocket launcher, and he just stood up, and he fired around, and sure enough, it was about 700 yards. He popped that damn bunker, and they come out of that bunker. I could see them through my telescope. They were shaking their head and getting excited, but the Chinese, which they were at the time, we didn't realize it, but they were Chinese, had a ground cloth, maybe about, I guess 6 by 6, and it was white. And they would put it over their heads and run with the ground cloth extended and then flop down in the snow and pull this ground cloth over them, and it was white, and they blended it in with the snow. You could not see them. You could. But the mistake was when they stood up and held it up, it was just a big black square up there that you knew that right in the middle of it was a Chinaman. Mm-hmm. So it was just wonderful shooting. It was just a great day. I was knocking them down left and right. Just got tired of shooting, just knocking them off so easy every time they stood up. But we decided that we'd spent enough time up there, and they had pulled us off. We went down. There were almost 100 trucks in that convoy going to what was later called Hellfire Valley. One of the other elements that was on that was the 401 Independent Royal Marine Commandos. They were there, and their leader of their commando unit was a lieutenant colonel. Chesty Puller, who was our regimental commander, was colonel, decided that Lieutenant Colonel David Drysdale, or Douglas Drysdale, would be the convoy commander. He was in charge, and it became Task Force Drysdale, with a Royal Marine in charge of Americans. That's the second time that we have fought side by side with the Royal Marines against the Chinese. But it was one of the first times that I can remember in history-wise that we were under the command of a foreign officer. He was a very competent officer, really great. Those commandos were fantastic doing their job. They were great people, good bunch of boys. But we also had an Army unit with us, which was the B Company of the 31st Infantry. They had turned around when we met so much resistance after we launched it off. We were less than a half a mile out of the coterie. You could see the CP back there, and the Chinese were running up on the road and putting roadblocks behind us. But once we turned the vehicles around, and we're going to go back because there was too much resistance, we turned them around. We got the word to turn them around. Then we got the word to turn them around again. We turned them around. We're going back towards Hagaroo, our initial cause, and the word was that Chesty Puller had not told us to come back. He said he'd gotten word from the division commander, get through to Hagaroo at all cost. So the Royal Marines turned around. George Company, 1st Marines, we turned around. The Army did not turn around. We had also in amongst us a large portion of headquarters battalion of the 1st Marine Division. It was General Smith's staff and a lot of his officers. There was a lieutenant colonel in there amongst them, and there were several captains and majors, but we didn't know anything about their rank. And they just stayed low. One of them could have been in charge, but they didn't turn around. We busted through. They stopped and stayed there, stayed overnight, and surrendered the next morning. Some of the commandos had escaped and got through to us. But we made the rest of the 11 miles, fought every step of the way. Chinamen running up to the trucks, we were shooting them right in the face as they were running up. Machine guns all over the place. It was really a tough stretch, that Hellfire Valley, those 11 miles. But we started out at 9 o'clock in the morning. We got into Hagaroo 11 miles later, about 1 in the next morning. And most of the 401 Independent commando was with us. All of George Company was there, but none of the Army of the Bravo Company B Company, 31st Infantry was there, and very few of Headquarters Battalion was there. They all stopped and surrendered. We made it through, spent the night at Hagaruri, got a little sleep, and the next morning we assaulted what they called East Hill. My company commander during all of this was a gentleman by the name of Carl L. Sitter, Captain Sitter. He led us through that 11 miles. I saw him more times than I can think of during those battles. Every time we stopped, I saw him. Every time we landed in a trench, he'd be there. We took the assault, take this hill. There was a key element of geography. This element of terrain blocked everything coming in or out of Hagaruri. It had open fire on the airstrip that they were building, both roads coming in, and it just was a key, critical terrain factor, and we had to take it. The night before, the battalion executive officer had gone up there with a makeshift company of Marines from headquarters that he found around Hagaruri and did the best he could. Couldn't hold it, but for his efforts, Bruce Myers got the Medal of Honor. So Captain Sitter took us up there. We got to the top. We were spread pretty thin. We had a lot of casualties from the day before. Squads were down to maybe 4 men out of 12 or 13. The platoon of 40 men was down to about 18 men. We did the best we could, filled in as much as we could, and we were spread pretty thin. And that night we heard the bugles, and we put some illumination up, and the small arms fire started, and the mortar fire started. And every time we'd get a little illumination, we could see down into this little draw, and you could see the Chinese coming about 8 men abreast, shoulder to shoulder, maybe 2 or 3 deep. They were just coming in little clumps at us, so it was just very easy to shoot in these clumps. But when there was no illumination, or you couldn't, the ricochets, you couldn't make them out, they just kept on coming. During this battle, we got reinforcements. We got 3 South Korean soldiers who were inductees, draftees. They were just farm boys that had no training whatsoever, didn't even know how to unload their M1 rifles, and all they had was 1 clip, so we immediately put them to work digging a hole. And then the concrete was frozen. It was 30 below zero. I heard all kinds of exaggerations on what the temperature was. Some people saying wildly as much as 70, but I don't believe that. I didn't have a thermometer, didn't know exactly what it was, but it surely was so cold that every bone in your body hurt. It just was painful. It was cold. You couldn't eat, you couldn't drink. Everything was frozen. The canteens with water were frozen. You'd break off a piece of chicken and vegetables and put it in your mouth and hope it would thaw. The corpsmen had their morphine syrettes. They would put them in the sides of their mouths to get some body temperature in it so they could use them so they weren't frozen. Or they'd put them in their armpits or whatever they could do to keep them warm so they could use them. But it was a hell of a fight. I was wounded about 2 o'clock in the morning. I was sitting at the top. I was firing down on the ridge as they were coming, and I rolled over. My 03 telescope rifle was of no value at that point in the dark. I had acquired an M1 carbine, a 30 caliber, that had a 30-round magazine in it, and I had plenty of carbine ammunition, and I was just firing away with that. And the Chinese started running through us on the flank where we were lightly defended, and they were coming up at us from in front of us as well. I rolled over off the hill and sat up and was loading the clips, putting more ammunition in my magazines, which I had fired all the rounds out, when I took a bullet through the bottom of my foot and it came out the ankle because they had overrun us and now they were coming back out. And they were shooting us, and they all had Thompson submachine guns, 45 caliber submachine guns that they had gotten from Lend-Lease, I think, when we decided to arm Chiang Kai-shek in China. We'd given them all kinds of weapons from World War II, and their weapon of opportunity was a 45 caliber Thompson submachine gun, and they maybe only had 1 man carrying the gun, but they'd have 4 or 5 carrying the magazines for it. So I started back down because I couldn't walk, I couldn't move. It felt like I'd been hit with a whip right in the ankle bone, and some Marine that had had his arm pretty badly shot off grabbed me by the collar, the hood of my parka, It was just like a toboggan going downhill because it was all full of snow. It was a hell of a time getting up there. It was just nothing getting down. It was just going like a toboggan when we went down. He let me go, and I went clunk right into the railroad tracks. There was plenty of people at the bottom. They picked me up and threw me in a Jeep trailer and took me to the aid station, which the aid station was an old barn that had livestock that they had just moved out of there. And it was open slats. It was just a primitive shelter that keep the snow and the rain off the animals, but there was no protection from the wind coming through there. I got a shot of morphine. They put me on a litter and gave me a blanket, took my weapons, everything, I pistols, everything I had, pistol that they'd taken away, taken my carbine. My 03 is still laying up on top of that hill, on top of hanging from a tree branch with my Werner telescope on. It's probably in some Chinese museum. We stayed there overnight. They gave us a hot cup of coffee in the morning, something, a little bit of weak, like a porridge, a soup. It wasn't a soup, it was just some kind of hot water. They didn't have that much food there anyway at the time, but they did give us some food that morning. And I think even later on they got some powdered eggs and made some scrambled eggs, and we had some scrambled eggs there and soup. All of a sudden these Army folks started coming in. We had one stove, and it's as big as this room, as big as a basketball court that building was for livestock. And these Army people come in and started getting around the heater, and it got cold all of a sudden because what little heat was coming out, we couldn't share it with the Army people all around us. And they didn't appear to be wounded. And one of their medical officers come in and said, "What are you doing here?" And he started throwing them out as quickly as he could. Then the naval officer, medical doctor, got in there. There was nothing wrong with them. They used it from Task Force Faith on the other side. Had thrown away their weapons, had thrown away their ammunition, had thrown away their helmets. And there were officers among them and staff non-commissioned officers. And just boogied out of there. They left their wounded, they left their dead. And during this process, there were some Marines that were unconscious laying in their litters. I actually saw Army soldiers take their tag off of a wounded Marine, that showed that he had been given a shot of morphine and what his name was and everything, tie it on themselves and go out and get on an airplane. A lot of them did that till they wised up, so they couldn't carry us out because the planes were getting filled with these Army people who were not wounded at all. They might have had a little frostbite, but they were just cowards. They run off and left their people. To this day, I have no respect at all for those people. And after the 2 days in that aid station, the corpsman came in and said, "The Marine Corps is finally going to retreat." Well, that's typical sailor jargon. We were going to fight in a new direction. We were coming out with everything we had. We were bringing our dead, our wounded, all of our equipment. They had to burn some tents and things like that we didn't need, but they were getting ready to evacuate it. So I thought I'd go outside. I crawled out on my hands and knees and got outside to see what the hell was going on after my third day in there. And I saw the airplane there, the pilot standing there and everything, and one of the corpsmen were out there. They were just too tired to carry any more litters out. They said, "Go ahead, get on the airplane." So they helped me up. I hopped over to the airplane, got on it. It was a Goonie Bird, I guess a C-47, a Marine Corps version of a C-47. I think they call them RD-4. And they had litters in there, and I got in a litter. They tied me all down. Some severely wounded guys in there. Some guys that weren't wounded, I think. And a little master sergeant, a Marine master sergeant, came aboard. He had a cigar in his mouth, and the smoke was coming out of his mouth. He said, "This is my aircraft, I'm the pilot, and there'll be no smoking on my aircraft." And he blew out a big cloud of smoke. And he walked up and got in the pilot's seat. His co-pilot was a Marine Corps major. He was an enlisted man, but he had the experience. At the time, he's one of the old Marine Corps enlisted pilots. He knew what he was doing. But he was just joking about the no smoking. We lit up right away. And the nurses were aboard, Navy nurses and Army nurses. And they were right in the mix of it all, right in there. Small arms fire coming down on the airplane and everything. And I was evacuated. Went to a medical evacuation hospital at Hungnam. spent a day there. Started to thaw out a little bit. I had my first bowel movement in about 4 days. You just couldn't do that in the cold. You could barely urinate in the cold because it was just too cold. It took an act of heroism to pull your pants down and do something like that. But that's the fact. And I was evacuated to another Army hospital, flown into Japan, spent a couple of days there, and then was sent up to the Naval Hospital in Yokosuka, Japan. Spent Christmas and New Year's there, and sometime in the first part of February, I was evacuated back and came all the way back from hops from different California, Texas, all over the country, and ended up in the St. Albans Naval Hospital in Long Island, where I stayed for about a year and a half. The wound had penetrated the 5th and 4th metatarsals and shattered them, and that bone up above it, I can't remember. And so it took quite a bit of healing in those small bones in the foot. So I was in the hospital for about a year, went out to flight duty for a while, and then came back and had to have some more surgery. But the last surgery I took, we wore a non-effective piece of equipment called a shoe pack. It's just like an LL Bean boot. It is rubber on the bottom, and then just like a dress shoe, rubber on the bottom, and then leather all the way up, just like the old LL Bean boot. And it was useless. It was just a rubber boot is all it was. And at 30 below zero, every one of us had frostbite. My wound in the foot, the blood froze immediately, so I didn't lose a lot of blood. And of course I did freeze both my feet. And the one foot was more severe than the other, but I had to come back. And in the bottom of this shoe pack, there was a horsehair insert, like the Dr. Scholl's inserts that they put in shoes. But it was about a ½ an inch thick, and that was a little barrier to keep you away from the cold. And it wasn't that effective, but the last surgery I had, they took a big wad of that horsehair out of my foot about a year later. It had been in there. And I developed that the wound would never heal. It just drained continually for a couple of years. And then I went back to the Brooklyn Navy Yard and did a little duty there, same place I'd been before. Then I went from there to 2nd Marine Division at Camp Lejeune, again an infantry company, dog company, 2nd Battalion, 6th Marines. And from there I was ordered to Paris Island and did a couple of years on the drill field as a drill instructor. Back into the hospital. After that I went to the 3rd Marine Division in Japan, came back from that. I've done a little embassy duty. I did a little duty NROT, Naval Reserve Officers Training Corps at the University of Pennsylvania. And went back to Vietnam in '65 and was a Master Sergeant. And I was working in the operations center of the S3 section of an infantry battalion, 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines. I was commissioned as 2nd Lieutenant, and I went to the 1st Battalion, 7th Marines. Instead of being the operations chief, I became an assistant operations officer, S3. And at 1-7, as a 2nd Lieutenant, the epitome of my success was that I actually became the operations officer, the S3, of an infantry battalion in the field, in combat. And I did that because they relieved the previous S3, and I took over. So that's not a job for a 2nd Lieutenant, but I did the best I could, and apparently it was good enough.
Now, I noticed that during your career, you received 2 Bronze Stars with V devices. Do you want to tell us about how you received those?
Yeah, my first Bronze Star I got in street fighting in Seoul. As we came upon an elevated train, and there was a tunnel that went underneath the train, and the 2nd Platoon of George Company had gone through this little tunnel overpass, whatever you want to call it, and they were just murderous fire. There was an ambush in there, and one of our squad leaders had been shot badly, and Jack Dunn, the fellow I told you that blew that North Korean off of a horse, got a Silver Star there for a one-man operation with a BAR, just fought the whole damn ambush all by himself and got everybody out that was wounded and killed out of there. So with that pressure on the second platoon, we were going to sweep around and take the pressure off it from the rear. So we climbed the railroad tracks and we went as far as we could. We came to a pea patch, just a level pea patch. It had all these inclines and little ravines all the way around it, but the level little pea patch. But it had a machine gun on top of it, 2 men in a machine gun, and they were just knocking the hell out of us. And I thought I could get around on the flank and maybe knock that out. So I told the platoon sergeant, said, I'm going, so I had a bunch of grenades and I just ran around. I was flanking and I was running down the path that went down and up and down and up. And all of a sudden, right in the center of the path, a North Korean had dug a hole and he stood up and he fired. He had a white shirt on. It just, everything kind of stops there for a minute. He had a white shirt on. His hair was as if it was electrified. It was about 4 or 5 inches long and stood straight up in the air. And he fired around. And what he'd do is he'd go back in the hole, work the bolt on his carbine, go around in the chamber and come up at the same time. He would fire and drop back down in. The first round hit me right in the forehead, but what it did was it ricocheted right in front of me, just a couple of feet from front of me when I was running up a little bank. And it hit me in the forehead, just below the helmet and close to the nose. It knocked me down. I thought I was dead. It was a hell of a wallop. And I started feeling around the back of my head. I just thought that I had blown out the back of my brains and there was no blood. And I reached up, I could feel the blood coming down my face, and I was feeling around with my fingers to see if I could find a hole where the bullet went in. There was no hole. It was just a ricochet. It done me some damage, but I realized I was all right, so I crawled up further to the right where there was a little cover. There was a bush or two up there. I got off the path, and I laid my scope down on where that North Korean was. What they had done is I said white shirt, they would take off their uniforms and drop them, and they have a white long sleeve underwear underneath and white trousers like pajamas. And that's what they do. That's what a lot of the Koreans wore. So that's what they were doing. They were dropping their uniforms and just melding in with the civilians, and they would throw away their weapon or keep it. And we couldn't tell the bad guys from the good guys. But this guy had his blouse off. All I saw was a white shirt, which you don't normally expect anybody in a white shirt to shoot you. But I watched him, and he would come up and shoot. Then I realized what he was doing. He would come up and shoot, and it was just that fast. So I had my scope, and I laid it right on. It was just 50 feet away. It was the best shot I ever made in my life. As he came up, I pulled the trigger. I saw the top of his hair. I pulled the trigger. I blew him right out of that hole. So I killed the guy that shot me. I got up a little closer to the pea patch. I figured that was as good a place as any. Pulled the pin on my grenade, let the spoon fly, stood up, and there they were. It was a perfect pitch. They were that close. Right into the machine gun nest, blew it up. And at that time, the platoon sergeant called me that we were pulling back. So I went back to the lines, and there was a machine gunner that Calvin knew was his name, who was told, like everyone else, keep your head down, keep your head down. Little Calvin didn't keep his head down. And Calvin had got shot right through the lip here. It went in through the roof of his mouth and blew out the back of his head. And he was bleeding. I've never seen him. You can't imagine the blood that will come out from a head wound. And he was still on his hands and knees. So I lowered him down, and the lieutenant said, see if you can help him, see if you can do anything with him. So I lowered him down, and we all had these wool sweaters. They call them the baby shaker. They were army sweaters. They were beautiful sweaters. They were warm, and we cherished them. And I could see that Calvin knew was going into shock. So I bundled up his shirt, took the knife out of my boot, and started to cut his sweater. And I could see him say, no, 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 not my sweater, not my sweater. He was worried about his sweater. Here the man was ready to die. So gee, I took the knife, put it back in my sheath, and got the damn sweater off the guy. Took the flap that was laying on the back of his collar, put it up back on his skull, tied a bandage around his forehead and around his chin, and we were getting ready to pull back. So Calvin knew it was just like a dead weight. It's very difficult to pick up somebody that way. But the adrenaline was pumping, and I guess I had that extra strength. I picked him up, threw him over my shoulder in a fireman's carry, and ran back. And as we were running back, of course, they were shooting at us. A couple of rounds there was no machine gun shooting at us, just rifle fire. And I thought I felt Calvin get hit again while we were running. So these rounds were busting all around. So as soon as I got to the railroad track, I dove over the railroad track and let him go. And a couple of corpsmen picked him up, and they took him on back. And the end of the story was, 35 years later, I met Calvin New. I saved Calvin New's life. The first thing he said to me, "You son of a bitch, you broke my neck when you threw me down." I couldn't get over that he was mad that I broke his neck. It just chipped it a little bit, but he was still alive, and I saved his life. And for what I just described, I got a Bronze Star with a V. My second Bronze Star I got in Vietnam as a second lieutenant. We had a patrol out, and what the tactic was they would ambush the patrol, and it was a headquarters battalion patrol, headquarters company patrol, not battalion. It was H&S Company 17. We had our own area patrol other than the rifle companies. We were spread so thin. There were miles and miles between rifle companies that we just couldn't cover all the terrain. So we took some people from H&S and they trained them into patrolling and patrol methods, and they were out there and they had one wounded and they were drawing small arms fire. So the reaction force, everybody in the camp that wasn't on watch, would form up and we would go and rescue them. And what the method was to go along the road with the truck and get to where they were and then go get them and put them on the truck and bring them back. And the North Vietnamese knew that, so they would just spring the ambush, wait for the truck to come, and then they'd have us in an L-shaped ambush and go after the truck. My battalion commander was a Lieutenant Colonel Basil Lupka. His name was shortened to Buzz. His contemporaries called him Buzz. Of course, we enlisted men called him Colonel or Sir, or behind his back we called him Buzz Saw. He had a unique idea, a tactic. He was going to swim down the river with 2 landing vehicle tractors, which we had assigned to us, and come up from behind and get that squad that was out on patrol, the wounded, and get them out of there. So I formed up the reaction force, and as I say, they were all H&S Company people, and they didn't believe in carrying a full unit of fire, 100 rounds or magazines full, and they were a little light, and they didn't have any grenades or anything. So the first thing you do when you go on a patrol is you inspect your patrol. And the battalion commander didn't say a word to me because I started inspecting them. Time was of essence. Those people were out there being hurt. But I wasn't going to go out there half-witted or half-loaded. And sure enough, I started sending them all back to get a full unit of fire. They'd show up with 1 magazine, 20 rounds. Typical of those H&S Pogues. So I got them all full unit of fire, some grenades and everything. And the headquarters commandant, which was the company commander of those people that were out there, was just jumping up and down, mad as hell, because I wouldn't go right away. Well, we swam down. I got them on the radio. I had a radio, and they had a radio. I was talking to them. They had no compass. They didn't know where they were going. They couldn't read the map properly. I was trying to get them to walk towards the sun, and we were down in the water, in the valley, and they were up high. So I said, walk to your right as far as you can. Just pick out the spot and walk to your right. Keep walking. And sure enough, there they popped up on the ridge line. And I said, okay, I can see you now on the ridge line. Can you see me? No, come a little further. They could finally see us. I said, okay, start coming down. So they came down. There was no way we couldn't swim in close to the beach because it was the Sang Traban River, and it was mostly silt. And the tractors couldn't get through that silt. They would just bog down and stop. So I told them to come on down, and there were a bunch of little coconut or palm branch boats that the Vietnamese would use. They were in an area where they shouldn't have been because there was nobody living there. It probably was the Viet Cong were coming in at night and going to the village to visit their wives and girlfriends. So we put them in I told them to get in the sand pans and they paddle out by hand. They got in the LVT, I took my Thompson submachine gun that I had, I just carried when I was going on patrols or when I was going on to visit the Combined Action Company, which was one of my duties. I'd carry the Thompson in the Jeep. And I sunk the boat that they came out in. I just cut it in half with a Thompson. And we swam on back. Had a corpsman, got everybody below deck, done the patrol, and had the corpsman start working on the young man had a bullet round through his foot, or his leg, lower part of his leg. And we got all back, and of course you wore a flak vest, and I wore my second lieutenant bars underneath my flak vest. So we got in there, and I dismissed the reaction force, and I said, go on back to your assigned duties. And I took off my flak vest, and I turned around and started walking away. And I heard one of them say, God damn it, he's only a second lieutenant. I thought he was a gunnery sergeant. If I had known he was a second lieutenant, I never would have gone out there. Now, I could have gone back and said something that I thought that was hilarious. Having spent 20 years as an enlisted man, having held every rank to master gunnery sergeant, including gunnery sergeant, I thought it was funny. But I just let them go. They did a good job. They were out there in harm's way after I got them all loaded up with their proper unit. From then on in, anytime the reaction force fell out, they had a full unit of fire.
Okay, hold right there. I'm going to change tapes. Okay, we're rolling.
I mentioned cutting the sampan in half with a 45. As soon as I got back, I went to the colonel, gave him a verbal report, a situation report of what had happened and how the operation had gone. And a short while later, he came up to me and said that, why did you cut that boat in half with a 45 Thompson submachine gun? I said, because it didn't belong there, and it was probably being used by the VC, and I didn't want them to have it. And the bells went off inside my head. Now, somebody else had told him, he'd gotten a report from one of the troops about what I had done and how I handled myself. And I just thought it was odd that they would do something like that. So the Bronze Star that I got, it was a combined action company. We had a squad of Marines in a village with popular forces. These were Vietnamese, South Vietnamese, that we had trained how to go out on patrols with us and run ambushes with us, and how to fire a weapon and whatnot. They also had these popular forces, PFs. The people from the village were combined action, but the people, they had regional folks that were called popular forces. And they would come with their own platoon leader, and they were a mob of people, Vietnamese, all armed to the teeth, and you really didn't know, you didn't have a good feeling about them, you didn't know how they were going to go. So one of my jobs is to round them all up and take them back to the district headquarters, and then from district to take them up to the province headquarters, Quang Ngai province, because they didn't know how they were going to operate. They weren't doing too well in combat or on operations. So they were a motley bunch, and a vehicle in front of us got hit a mine, so we went around them as fast as we could, and I just barreled out. But I thought if we've ever been hit and had to get out of our vehicles, I just had about 10 Marines with me, and I had about 100 of these PFs in about 4 or 5 trucks, that we could probably expect some fire from our own popular forces right on us. So I got them there as fast as I could. So that and a few other reaction situations that I took out, all combined got me a Bronze Star, my second Bronze Star, for several events, and that was one of them. And the colonel, after he told me about chopping up the boat, the sampan with the Thompson, he said, get rid of that Thompson, I don't ever want to see it again. Yes, sir. So I made sure he never saw it again, but I didn't get rid of it. After my tour in Vietnam, I came back and I went to Quantico, and I was training the young lieutenants at the basic school. college graduates that were going to become Marine Corps officers how to shoot the pistol and how to qualify with a pistol. I was a range officer, and I did remarkably well with the young lieutenants. I'd have sometimes, I maintained about a 98% qualification record with them because they understood what you were telling them, and I walked them through everything. I might add, one of the bad marks of those 2%ers that didn't make it, we had General Chesty Puller. I told you about him when he was a regimental commander, became a general and retired as a lieutenant general from the Marine Corps. His son was in one of those platoons, and it was Lewis Burwell Puller Jr., Chesty's son, second lieutenant. And he came to me after just completing the rifle range, and he did not qualify with the M14 rifle. He was unqualified. And that's really a bad mark when a lieutenant can't qualify with a weapon if he's going to be a troop leading officer. I got him on a pistol, and he was just doing the same thing. He was just trying too hard. He was trying to do as good as his father, and there's no man alive that could do, no one could do as good as Chesty did. But he tried, and he tried too hard. I worked with him. I kept him back after the company, the lieutenants left. I would work on him, and a few other people. I had what I called an X squad, and I would take them up as close as I am to this camera and put a pistol in their hand, and the muzzle of the pistol might be 2 feet away from the target, and I'd make them shoot that close. And I'd start backing them up, get them 15 yards, get them to 25 yards, making a little bit of progress, trying to tell him that he had to stop trying to be his father, settle down, and try and shoot the pistol. Do what I told him. But I've got to tell you that I wasn't successful. He did not qualify with a pistol. He went over to Vietnam, panicked a little, stepped on a landmine and blew both his legs off at the hip, blew his arm off. Poor young Puller finally committed suicide. Yeah. But that was one of the only ones that, of those 2%ers I had at Quantico. Also at Quantico, I went to the Marine Corps Reserve Training Center and helped write manuals for reservists, update the manuals from what we had in the Marine Corps to more or less adaptable to reserve outfits, reserve training outfits. After Quantico, I had 22 years in the Marine Corps, and I asked for my twilight cruise, my last cruise in the Marine Corps, to be Albany, New York, at the Reserve Training Center in Washington and North Maine. And the Korean War was still going on. It was the 70s. I came back in '67 and 2 years at Quantico. It was in 1970, 71. We were getting a lot of casualties, and primarily my duties at the Reserve Training Center were to, I would notify families that their sons had been killed in action or were seriously wounded. We had some from Glens Falls that were seriously wounded. And I covered everything from Plattsburgh down to about Newburgh, and as far west as Cooperstown. And arranged all the funerals, took care of all the paperwork to resolve the insurance and death benefits and everything. And I did that till I retired from the Marine Corps. And I retired from the Marine Corps in January 1971.
Now, how old were you at that point?
I was 71. I was 41 years old. But I might add that I was almost a 40-year-old second lieutenant. You know, and they're usually about 20 years old. So I was. What my colonel, my battalion commander, Buzz Luca, called me a mature second lieutenant. A lot of people, one of the questions they asked me is, why did you go from a master sergeant to being a second lieutenant? Because I could talk back to officers if I was a second lieutenant, and I couldn't as a master sergeant. And I talked back to one of these captains that he was finally cashiered out of the Marine Corps. He was just they used to say that there were Marines that were born Marines, Marines could be trained to be Marines, and those that could neither be Marines would never be Marines. And this guy, this captain, was the latter. He should never have been a Marine, but he was a captain. And I just gave him bloody hell. He would report his company on on an objective, and I could see the objective, and I knew he wasn't. I'd be as a liaison working with the Republic of Korea. Their Marines, they had a Blue Dragon outfit over there, so I was a liaison officer with the Korean Marines who were fighting and helping us. And I'd call back to the colonel and say that Delta 6 says he's on objective B, but he's nowhere near it. And I can see objective B, and he's not there. And the colonel would get on the horn, and finally he relieved him and sent him back. But I talked back to that guy quite a bit. And there was another captain, I called him Captain Allergic. But I could get away with that because they would go to the colonel and say, "Sir, Lieutenant Pendas was disrespectful to me and spoke in an insubordinate manner." And Buzz Lupka would put his hand on their shoulder and say, "Captain, you got to realize that Pendai is a mature second lieutenant." So I got away with it.
Now, what was your favorite weapon?
That Thompson submachine gun was my favorite weapon. Now, when the battalion went in the field, and we were in the field for 30 or more days, you couldn't carry that thing because it's heavy. And I had 3 magazines, and they weighed 4 or 5 pounds. And then I had a magazine and the weapon. It was just too heavy to carry. But if you went in a vehicle or if you were just going for a short distance, that was my favorite weapon. But I couldn't get near a rifle, to try and be a sniper or anything. Some officers that had been snipers or had been team shooters always wanted to get back at the rifle, and that was not our job. Yeah, we were leaders, and we just couldn't be up there shooting. But the Thompson, for my money, when I was in a Jeep, if we got fired out, I had 7 combined action companies. I started to tell you, a squad of Marines with locals. And they were scattered all over the peninsula we were on, Songtrabon Peninsula, Able Company, Baker, Charlie, and Dog, and then we had a couple of other ones, so I had 7 of them. And the only day that I could get to inspect them, the battalion commander had gave me additional duties as the Popular Forces Training Officer. I was the bond officer, special service, I had a bunch of other court martial. Those were all additional duties. My assistant S3 was my primary duties, but he gave me that job so I could go in there to these companies and not look like a spy that didn't belong there. And I could find out what was going on, and I would come back and brief my battalion commander if the parent company was taking care of them or not taking care of them. If they were getting their food and everything and their rations, and if they had enough to survive. But those 7 combined action companies that I could inspect was only on a Sunday, because that was the only time a vehicle was available that I could use. All our vehicles were going full bore all the time, carrying troops and rations and what have you. But Sunday was kind of a quiet day. The only other guy that went out with me on a Sunday was our chaplain. He would take his Jeep and we'd meet down the motor pool, and his name was Father Capodanno. And Father Capodanno was a lieutenant in the United States Naval Reserve, and he was our chaplain. And he would go out and do his work, and I would go out and we would part. We would go down to the ferry because we were on an island, and there was no way to get out of the Songtrabon Peninsula. We had to go too far, and there was no roads going back, so we had to take an LSM, a landing ship, medium, that would carry a tank. And we put 2 or 3 trucks or a couple of Jeeps on them. We would cross the river, and then he'd go his way and I'd go my way. Sometimes but he would hold mass at all 4 rifle companies, and then back to battalion. And I would go around and check all my combined action people. And I mentioned Father Capodanno 2 or 3 years ago. I went to the Cathedral of Immaculate Conception in Washington, D.C., and it's 40-some odd years after the Vietnam War. And Father Capodanno, on that day when I was there, had been declared, I'm not a Catholic, a servant of God. And that is the first step to sainthood. So he's on the short list with the last pope, and Father Capodanno's there. So it takes about 6 years, and it could possibly be that my friend, Father Capodanno, might become a saint within this 6-year period. So I hope I can live long enough to see that happen, because Capodanno was I had an interview with the Archbishop in Louisiana. Same thing, he wanted to tape it for a Catholic program that they have. And I told him, I said, I think that Capodanno might look down his nose on sainthood. And the Archbishop came up and started spinning his ring and got all excited, stepped down to become a saint. And what do you mean by that? He came right out of his throne to talk to me as you were been sitting there. We were both, he had a big, huge red chair, and he came out of his throne. What do you mean? I said, Father Capodanno was already an angel, and the saint is just a man-made position. He's already been a servant of God, because I really, truly believe Capodanno was an angel. He just ignored all the hostilities, all the events that took place. He was killed right out there in the open, taking care of his Marines, giving them the last rites. An example, we were on an operation, and the colonel didn't want to let Capodanno go with us, didn't want him in the field, but he finagled his way out there, and he told everybody to watch Capodanno. He was to stay right in the headquarters, CP. He wasn't to go out anyplace. And it was raining, and we had the monsoons going on, and one of the companies had to cross a creek. Now, the creek had swollen with all this rainwater until it was a fast-moving river. And they had linked arms to get across this body of water. It was swollen, and the chain broke, and 2 Marines were washed down. And you got to realize there are trees underwater, and the branches are going in the wrong direction, and the water is so swift. It's so very easy to get caught up in one of those branches underwater. So 2 Marines drowned. They're dead. And I got it over the radio right away, and I sent a runner to the colonel to tell him that we had 2 casualties out there. And Capodanno come walking over and said, what's going on? And I said, we just had a couple of casualties in Able Company. They were trying to cross a river, and the chain broke, the human chain broke, and they were washed away, and they're missing. They're trying to find them right now. He says, where are they at? Well, I could show them on a map, but that was of no good. I said, they're out this way, and we were in the jungle, we were right out in the operations and everything. It was a misty morning, and just a terrible, with all that rain and everything. And they said, they're that way about 2 clicks, meaning about almost 2 miles. And off he went. I'm not going to tell him he can't go. He's a Navy lieutenant, and he's my friend, and he's a chaplain. And off he went. No bodyguard, nobody with him, he just went. And maybe 2 hours later, through the mist, like a Cecil B. DeMille movie, here comes Father Capodanno. He's leading a bunch of Marines back. And they've got doors that they ripped off of some hooches, some buildings. And they got the 2 dead Marines on the doors, and they got the doors on their shoulders. And there's 6 Marines carrying each dead Marine. And just that mist and everything, and Father Capodanno coming out of it like that, to me it was almost like a miracle. How we found them is beyond my, how he got to where they were, how he found them is beyond my comprehension. I have no idea how he did that, but he did. He might have had divine guidance, but he found them, found the bodies, and brought them back. And I just thought that was really something. But he was just a remarkable man. And we shared a tent together when they were building the new chapel. We were building this is a grass hut for a chapel, but while they were building it for him, he stayed in the tent with him. And he was a great fellow, great human being. And he was a good friend of mine. The 3 of the battalion, which was Major Ed Fitzgerald. They were good friends. They were both Catholics, and I'm not. So, but back then was all those other deals on the Sundays and everything, and what I'd done for a year, that all added up to 1 Bronze Star, and it involved a little combat, so I got a combat V with it as well.
Okay, and you mentioned you retired in 1971, and what did you do after that?
Well, it was bad times. The Vietnam War was still going on, and there were SUNY University was Albany State was right up the road there on Washington Avenue where we were, and they were having protests, and all the local network channels would set up their cameras right in front of the Marine Training Unit because they were hoping that the students who were marching down Washington Avenue would try and confront us and break the door down or break a window or something. But they didn't. They just went right on by us. But it was bad times. And a fellow by the name of Kerry from Massachusetts testified before a congressional committee that most of the Vietnam veterans were drug addicts and had killed women and children, and they had raped. He just gave us a bad song, and this guy had the balls to run for president. So when I'd go to a job interview, some 25-year-old kid right out of college, they asked me, I was 41 years old, what my drug of choice was, what drug I liked best, or did I kill any women and children? And of course, I wasn't very cool about it. I had commanded an infantry battalion. That was my highlight, being an S3, but once the colonel left, I commanded the whole damn thing. He was gone for a while. It was maybe only about a minute and a half, but I was the battalion commander for about 90 seconds. And I didn't turn tail. The Vietnam veteran that came back in 70, 71, 72, they went to ground. They grew long hair and a beard and everything, and they didn't tell anybody they were Vietnam veterans. But I did. I was proud of what I did for my country. I'd do it again. Marines go where they're sent to go. We don't make up our mind who we're going to fight for or what we're going to fight. But I could not get a good job. The only job I could get was with Fuller Brush Company on Fuller Road here in Albany, where it was Mohawk Brush at the time. And I went in there and took a job as a machine operator. And I showed up for work at 6:30 the next morning. They took me to my machine and showed me what I was going to be doing. And I picked up the first block and they said, that's enough. I never made one broom. They called me up to the front and said, you're going to be foreman of this area up in here. So I took over as foreman. I had some leadership capabilities. Those people realized it, and that I showed up, realized that within 6 months I was production manager of the whole front end of Mohawk Brush. The beginning of a brush to the end of a brush, the painting, the bristles, everything, just putting it together, and the marketing. But I had 6 or 7 departments that I was production manager of. I just ran them all. But that was the only job I could get till there was an article in the want ads for operations manager at the Gilroy Central Schools, and I went over and applied for that. And Mr. Charles Cascio was the principal of the Gilroy High School, and he was the man I was going to work for. Well, Chuck Cascio was a Navy corpsman in World War II, and he knew about Marines, and I knew about corpsmen, so we got off to a good start right away, and I got the job, and I served there for about 4 years, and was the operations manager of the high school. And what it entailed was all the jobs the principal didn't want to take care of, the insurance, the report cards, all the things, not that he didn't want to take care of, but he was too busy with other things. Things that normally a principal would do, I would do for him. And then they started cutting back on schools, and the enrollment rate started dropping down, and they wanted only people that lived in Gilliland to be working for the school district. So I lost my job at the high school, took a part-time job at the bus garage and in maintenance and bus, and I stayed there for another year or so, and then I went to just took the GI Bill and went back to Hudson Valley. One of the jobs I had in the Marine Corps was at the NROTC unit at the University of Pennsylvania, and one of the captains that I had saved his military life career for something that he did, and I warned him about it, that they were after him, saw me and wanted me to come up, and I went up to the University of Pennsylvania and was the gunnery sergeant of the NROTC unit, but his name was Earl Pappy DeLong, and Pappy DeLong said, "You're going to school, Gunny?" I said, "No, I'm not, sir. You know, I didn't finish high school." "Oh, yes, you are." So he took me over and enrolled me in the College of General Studies at the University of Pennsylvania, took me to my first class in English composition, threw me in the room just like a kid going into kindergarten, and closed the door. and I managed to get an Associate of Arts degree from the University of Pennsylvania, but thanks to him, he got me started. And in the meantime, I picked up the high school equivalency, and I'm back in with a class of 49 at the Barker Central Schools in Barker, New York. And got a degree from Penn, decided to go back to Hudson Valley, got another degree at Hudson Valley, and then I had some credentials in construction and things of that nature, and I was hired by the Rensselaer City School District as the superintendent of buildings and grounds and pupil transportation. And I had that for a while until they started the same thing. They wanted somebody that lived in Rensselaer to take the job. It got to be very political, the job, so I left them. Went to work for the post office, retired from the post office, and just now I do a little hunting and fishing, and I've got the best of both lives, and both worlds. I've got a little cabin in Texas where I spend my winters, and I don't have to look at snow anymore. The truth of it is I cannot stand the cold anymore. I just can't handle it. I used to love to ice fish and things like that, but it's just, the frostbite is too much, and it's just, I had too many operations on my feet, and it just too much. And then I spend my summers here in New York, and it just, after Election Day, we just head on back down to Texas. But I got a little cabin up on Lake Champlain, so I just got everything I want. All I need is the time to enjoy all these things.
Now, have you stayed in contact with people you served in the Marine Corps with?
Yeah, we have an association in the Marine Corps called the 1st Marine Division Association, and I joined them 30 some odd years ago, and they asked me to be on the scholarship committee, and the association gathers up funds from raffles and what have you, and contributions from the members, and we've been able to raise about $1.5 million, and we put about 300 some odd kids through college. Now, that's not a big number, but for guys just throwing in $5 or $20 in a hat, we're proud of what we've done. And then I took over as Admiral was the chairman of the scholarship committee, Admiral Haynes, and I relieved him when he quit. He wanted to go do other things, and I became the scholarship chairman. And I did that for 12 years and raised the stipend to $7,000 per year, per student. I think it's $1,700 some odd dollars a year. It's not a lot of money, but it helps a kid if the best he can do is go to a community college or a state school. It helps. So $7,000 over 4 years or 2 years, whatever it's going to, no, it can't be 2 years, it's got to be 4 years. But if they're going for a 2-year degree, it helps. And that's and we've managed to keep 60 dependents, children of either deceased, killed in action, prisoner of war, or missing in action. Their dependents, we helped them through school. And I was in that for 12 years. Now I was elected to become the president of the 1st Marine Division Association, and I just left that job in 2007 for 2 years. I was the president. It's a national organization. We had about 14,000 members when I first started, but the World War II guys are dying off so fast, and the Korean War guys are dying off so fast. So we're down to 11,500 members now. But we're always trying to do good, and we're trying to expand that now, and we're trying to restore hope. We've got another program now that we're trying to get Marines that are on active duty or ones that are wounded, trying to help them go to school. We're just trying to enlarge it just for dependents of deceased and 100% disabled to Marines that are wounded on active duty. And we're trying to we just started that program. It won't become effective till the 9th of November in 2009, but we hope that we get some big sponsors to be able to do some good for our wounded warriors as well.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for your interview.
My pleasure, sir.